Hey, welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. Today, I'm actually going to combine two different parts of the rubric together because students often get them mixed up. So today we're going to talk about outside evidence and context, and I'm going to try to make it clear what is the difference between those two. So first, we should understand that there's a lot of points to be had in these two parts of the rubric. Specifically outside evidence. I think in an open note, open book AP test, outside evidence is now well worth your time. You also can get up to 2 points for outside evidence, and that includes partial credit. So basically, if you have one really good piece of outside evidence, you get 1 point. If you have a second separate piece of outside evidence, you can get up to 2 points. You can only get 1 point for context. So if we're really choosing between the two, it makes a lot more sense to really practice a lot of outside evidence and try to bring that in as much as possible into your essay, especially since you'll have your notes out in front of you, so you don't necessarily have to come up with it all from memory. So first, what is outside evidence? I think the word outside is super confusing. I really think I'm going to propose we just recall it additional evidence because all it is just an additional piece of evidence that also answers the prompt. And so it just needs to be two things. It needs to be completely separate from the documents. It can't be just like a little fun fact that's added on that relates to a document. It needs to be its own separate thing. And it still needs to be within the parameters of the prompt. And I'll talk more about what that means in a second. The way you should really think about outside evidence is it's just an additional document. It's a sixth document. Obviously, you don't have to actually cite a specific document, right? You don't have to know of a painting or a quote, but you should think of it that way, that you would use a piece of outside evidence in your essay in the same way you would address and use a document to support your argument. So again, I really think we should just rename it. I'm going to petition the College Board to just rename it additional evidence because I think the word outside is what is tripping people up. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So let's just look at an example of outside evidence. Let's say this was my topic sentence for a body paragraph. And I wanted to argue that between 1450 and 1750, states used monumental architecture to consolidate power. And I'm going to use this document that was given to me by the College Board of this palace that was built by a Rajput king. He moved his court there, meaning all the noble people that kind of serve him would move with him. Great, I'm going to use that to answer this prompt, and that would get me credit for using the document. But if I also wanted to use additional evidence, then what I would need to think about is what are some examples of, let me get my color thing here, another state using monumental architecture to consolidate power in this time period, right? Kind of the parameters I've built for myself in this topic sentence. So I could talk about Versailles. I could talk about the Spanish tearing down Aztec and Incan temples and building cathedrals. I could talk about Shah Jahan building the Taj Mahal. Those all are within the time period, check. They all relate to state power, check. And they all relate to monumental architecture. So that is what outside evidence would be, is again, a totally separate, this has nothing to do with the Rajput kingdoms, but it is another example of what we're seeing in this document. Again, what a lot of students want to do for outside evidence is they want to talk about this document and then just give me some more information about the Rajput kingdoms. And it's like, well, that doesn't really help us at all, right? That doesn't help us better understand your answer. That's just more like fun facts. So what this is not you just pouring out every fact you can ever think of on the page. You want to be really strategic. Every sentence you write in the DBQ needs to be purposeful for a point on the rubric. And so once you've used this document, move on to a separate piece of evidence like Louis building Versailles and having the nobles come live with him there, right? Okay, now let's flip it and think about this same topic sentence and what context might look like. And then I think we'll start to see the difference. So let's say I wanted to contextualize this topic sentence. What I might say is, by 1450, so notice I'm talking about kind of what's going on before 1450, states had developed immense wealth thanks to post-classical trade routes. Again, I'm going from before 1450, right? Individual leaders had also grown more powerful by taking power away from traditional elites, especially in former feudal states. By the 15th century, leaders had the resources and the power to build monumental architecture to showcase their states. So context is you zooming out and helping the reader understand how we got to this point, right? How do we get to this point where starting in 1450, states are building these huge palaces or whatever to consolidate their power? So you're sort of zooming out, and that can be zooming out either in the time period or, like we'll see later, it could zoom out to a different part of the world if that relates to your prompt. Okay, so here's how to figure out the difference when you're writing your essay. You want to take a prompt. So let's take this US history prompt. Evaluate the extent to which social movements in the US achieved success in the 19th century. And what you want to do is you want to identify the parameters of that prompt. And an easier way to think of that is identify the keywords, right? If you were going to, let's say this was a published DBQ prompt and you wanted to go find it on the internet, you would Google DBQ. You wouldn't Google DBQ evaluate the extent. That's not the keyword, right? I mean, that's what it's asking you to do, but that's not going to help narrow it down. What you would Google is DBQ social movements, US 19th century. These are the parameters, right? They're saying within your essay, you need to focus on only social movements, right? You need to focus on only the United States, and you need to focus just on the 1800s. Those are now your parameters. So additional evidence or outside evidence needs to stay within those parameters. All of your additional evidence needs to be inside the United States, it needs to be a social movement, and it needs to be in the 19th century. Now, context needs to be from without. Context can be a few things. You can expand beyond social movements to talk about other movements that are going on in this same place in the same time period. You could talk about social movements in the 19th century somewhere other than the United States, or you could talk about social movements in the United States from before the 19th century. So you're kind of expanding one of these parameters. So again, you notice, like, if I'm going to talk about before the 19th century, I'm going to keep the United States and the social movements the same, and I'm just going to expand the time period. So I might talk about social movements in the 18th century and how that led us to where we are today. Or if I wanted to talk about other social movements, or movements beyond social movements, I'm going to stick to the United States and the 19th century, but I might expand to talk about rising industrialization and how that might explain some of these social movements. So what you're doing is outside or additional evidence is still following all of the parameters of the prompt, but context is taking one of those parameters and zooming out. Okay, let's look at some other examples of this. So this is kind of what I just talked about, but you want to read the prompt. You want to identify the keywords. Typically, the prompt is going to include up to these three things. They normally give you a more specific topic. That might be social movements, or it might be the connection between religion and trade, or whatever. They'll give you some sort of geographic area, the United States, Afro-Eurasia, Western Europe, whatever. And they'll normally give you a time period, the 19th century, 1450 to 1750, whatever. So all of your outside evidence needs to check all three of these boxes. And your context needs to expand one of these boxes, right? Go beyond social movements and talk about other things happening in 19th century United States. Go beyond the United States and talk about social movements in other countries in the 19th century, or go beyond the time period. And I'm going to really suggest you only go earlier. In theory, you can go later, but I just think it's really hard to do in a way that makes sense. So what you'd want to do is talk about what happened leading up to the 19th century with social movements in the US that kind of got us to this point. All right, let's look at some other examples. So again, what you could talk about here with outside evidence for the prompt that I've given you, social movements, US 19th century, you could talk about abolition. That would be additional or outside evidence, right? Because it is all three of those things. It's a social movement, it's in the US, it's in the 19th century. You could talk about women's suffrage. You could talk about anti-child labor or anti-Jim Crow, as long as you keep it within the 19th century, right? Because it needs to be within all of these parameters. Now, context, let's say you had this same prompt. Context could be about US social movements before the 19th century, and it could also talk about 19th century social movements outside the United States. And again, like I said, you actually could talk about other movements that aren't social movements in 19th century United States. But all of those things, the key here is that it has to connect back to the prompt. So it can't just be a fun fact. It needs to be, let's say, about how the rising industrialization, this other kind of economic movement that's happening, is going to lead to inequality and poverty that prompts a lot of social movements to begin. Or let's say you want to talk about political revolutions around the world and the rising kind of application of Enlightenment values, and how then that means that, like, women and the women's suffrage movement are going to use those same Enlightenment values to start up their own social movement, right? So it still needs to connect back to your prompt in some way. Okay, let's do this one more time with another prompt. Let's pretend we're doing a 3-document DBQ. Let's pretend the prompt is to analyze the causes of political revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Atlantic world. And we have these 3 documents. I'm not going to actually come up with these documents. Let's just pretend that they're there. So I could do context in one of 2 ways. I think the easiest way to do context is just to contextualize the prompt before you start really writing. So you basically are contextualizing your thesis statement, which means context would be the first thing in your essay. It might not be the first thing you write. You might go back and add it later, but it's the first thing the reader is going to read. So you might say something like, by the end of the medieval era, so notice I'm going from before the time period of the prompt in Europe, monarchs had grown powerful and wealthy, capable of controlling overseas colonies. In addition, their belief in their divine right to rule made them unresponsive to complaints within their state. Then that helps me understand my thesis, that by this time, the Atlantic world experienced revolutions caused by the spread of Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and a growing middle class that could act on these ideas. So I could use context in this way, right, where I'm literally just contextualizing the whole prompt and the general topic of the essay. You can put context other places. You can contextualize each body paragraph. So you could do this for each of your topic sentences. But in general, I think it's the smartest to have it be its own separate thing at the very beginning so that it doesn't get mixed in with you maybe evaluating documents or that sort of thing. Now, if I was going to move on and write one of these body paragraphs in this essay, I might say something like this to show you additional evidence. I might talk about Enlightenment ideas spreading to colonial subjects, and I would cite the, document 1, the Declaration of Independence. I would cite Toussaint Louverture fighting for the right to rule themselves. Then I'm going to bring in a third example, right, of a political revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Atlantic world that also relates to this topic sentence. So I might talk about Simón Bolívar. As a Creole, he was frustrated in his lack of power despite his Spanish heritage, so he pushed for self-government among the military juntas. So again, Simón Bolívar fits all these parameters. He's involved in a political revolution, he's in the right time period, and he's still in this Atlantic world. And so that counts as a piece of outside evidence as opposed to context. Okay, hopefully this was helpful. Let's recap one more time. The most important thing that you can do for yourself is first identify the keywords of the prompt so that you know for the most part just what you need to stay within. The only time you should move away from those parameters is to talk about context. Everything else in your essay should fit within those parameters. So that applies to using the documents, that applies to outside evidence, that applies to HIP. It applies to everything. Every other point in the rubric, 9 out of the 10, need to stay within these parameters of your prompt. Whatever the topic they want you to talk about, the area they want you to focus on, and the time period. The only single point really where you go beyond this is for contextualization. One slight exception to that is I talked about in my last video, HIP, and how one of those is the historical situation of a document. That might be the only other time that you would go from like outside the time period or an earlier time period to talk specifically about the historical situation of that document. But otherwise, the vast majority of your writing needs to stick to these keywords, which is why I would suggest when you start writing your essay, if you're going to type it in a Google Doc, the first thing you should do at the top of each page is type these keywords so you remind yourself where to focus. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Ooh, next time we're going to tackle the complex rubric point that is complexity. For the record, I don't think you should be worrying about this for the AP test, but it shows what good historical writing looks like, so I'm still going to do a video on it. All right. Thanks, y'all.